What is a wolf guy? It's a series that is both infamous and also somehow practically unknown. Time and time again, it's managed to repulse me, yet still recapture my attention in some weird way. So today we're going all in. We're going to look at everything that's available in English of the Wolf Guy franchise. Get ready for the ultimate Wolf Guy video, a definitive wolf guide, if you will. So where to start with Wolf Guy is kind of confusing and weird. There is an answer, but first we gotta talk about its origin. Wolf Guy was a manga first published in 1970 in Weekly Bokura magazine. This manga was later compiled into 2 volumes called Wolf Guy: The Origin. Now, while I bought both copies of the manga for the purposes of this video, my Japanese reading comprehension is incredibly low. However, the plot is discernible if you've absorbed every adaptation of Wolf Guy prior to it. I don't recommend starting here. But it's still interesting, and a lot of the foundation for later adaptations is laid here. Our main character is Inugami Akira, a real-life werewolf and possibly the last of his clan. He recently transferred into the delinquent-filled homeroom of Mrs. Aoshika, who is not only his teacher, but also his love interest. Later on, we're introduced to Jin Akira, who, unbeknownst to either Aoshika or Inugami, is in fact another werewolf. The original Wolf Guy might have been a shonen series, but it was running in the same magazine as Demon Lord Dante. So as one might expect, darker elements would start to appear, especially as chapters got more and more violent later on. The entire first volume straddles the line between a supernatural superhero story and a delinquent one. In fact, for the first 111 pages, Inugami doesn't even transform. Him being a werewolf seems almost incidental, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is an aspect that every adaptation seems to share. Towards the end of the first volume, Aoshika is captured by Yakuza, and it's up to Inugami to save her. And even not knowing the language, it's clear that this is a fantastically drawn sequence, and a fitting end for the first book. But more importantly, Inugami is injured so badly that he is apparently dead by the start of the second volume. It's only later that we find out that he's alive and being experimented on by mad scientists. But that's unfortunately where the run would be cut short, as Bokura magazine would stop publication. The OG Wolf Guy ends very abruptly as our main trio escapes into the horizon via motorboat. And while the original manga was cut short, this would only be the beginning for Wolf Guy. The manga was done by the artist-writer team of Sakaguchi Hisashi and Hirai Kazumasa, the latter of which would continue Wolf Guy as a series of novels. The manga is adapted as 2 separate novels, and the story continues from there. But more importantly, the novels would serve as a basis for every single adaptation going forward, the earliest one being in 1973. With Wolf Guy Mania hitting Japan, mania is actually a pretty strong word for a series with very little fanfare, it was inevitable that it would receive a theatrical adaptation. And in 1973, Wolf Guy fans got their long-awaited, about 2 years after the original manga's conclusion, adaptation in Crest of the Wolf. Crest of the Wolf, also known as Horror of the Wolf, covers the first book in the Wolf Guy novel series, meaning it covers about half of the original manga. It's more of a 70s delinquent movie than a horror movie, but that's actually incredibly fitting for the time. Japan's film industry in the 70s was shifting focus away from new wave and high-budget special effects movies, and into exploitation. Films in this era had to be made quick, cheap, and also had an expectation of a certain level of nudity in it. And Crest of the Wolf fits all three of these requirements. The film is told at breakneck speed, which might be a little hard to parse if you're not familiar with other versions of Wolf Guy. While the original manga was no stranger to violence, there's definitely more of it here, in addition to sex. You see, the novel ran with the darker tone of the manga's later chapters, and just kept going. And naturally, this fits right in line with the exploitation filmmaking of the 70s. Aoshika's kidnapping has now been turned into a sexual assault, and the result is less than tasteful. It's not even that the subject is handled poorly, it's just barely handled at all. It's just a way to get some tits into the movie more than anything else. This was released by Toho, yes, that same Toho, and this was their brief attempt at competing with Toei's more sleazier biker and delinquent movies, as those movies were becoming extremely popular at the time. And as a sleazy delinquent movie, how does Crest of the Wolf hold up? Well, it's kind of mixed. This would probably be a somewhat bland but completely passable movie if it wasn't for the Wolf Guy himself.
本当に犬神くんなんでしょ? 犬神さん、あなた。びっくりおもちゃの妖怪マスクですよ。よくできてるでしょ?
This absolutely incredible mask is the movie's greatest strength, and also its fatal flaw. On one hand, the mask and the werewolf effects are so bad that it turns the movie from okay into a laugh a minute when they're on the screen. On the other hand, it's impossible to take the film seriously, knowing that our main character can transform into this furry reject. The mask was apparently made with real Siberian wolf hair, but the way that it just lazily sits on the shoulders makes the whole thing look comical. So given that this movie has a fixation on rape and a god-awful wolf mask, is there anything worth seeing in Wolf Guy? Well, yeah, sort of. Crest of the Wolf is the debut film of one of Japan's legendary actors, Yusaku Matsuda. Matsuda would make a name for himself later on playing detectives and tough guys. Most notably, his final film role was in Ridley Scott's Black Rain. Matsuda is Japan's premier badass, and while this might be one of his lesser films, it's certainly a good performance. As Haguro, Matsuda plays the film's main villain, and does a pretty compelling job playing against our film's lead, Tado Shigaki. While Shigaki isn't as renowned as Matsuda, he certainly has some roles worth mentioning, most notably playing Andre in Rose of Versailles. His version of Inugami Akira is probably one of the more likable and at times more childlike interpretations. The rest of the cast isn't worth mentioning or is given very little to work with. Yoko Ichiji in particular is given very little to work with other than being a woman for Wolf Guy to save, which is worth mentioning because she is supposed to be our romantic lead here, despite being his teacher. Overall, for 70s delinquent movies, Crest of the Wolf is a middle-of-the-road movie marred by one extremely bad mask and wolf effect, turning it into a movie that's occasionally incredibly campy. And for all its problems, there's actually a far more problematic adaptation of Wolf Guy that we need to get into. This is the Wolf Guy that so many of you are probably familiar with. And if you're familiar with it, then you know that there's a big problem that we have to talk about later on. Trust me, we'll get to it, whether I want to talk about it or not. In 2007, a new Wolf Guy manga was written by Tabata Yoshiaki and Yogo Yuki. The team had previously worked on a manga called Akumetsu, and would later work on the incredibly edgy Shin Mazinger Zero. And if that means anything, it means that the art is superb. I honestly didn't even want to talk about this for that long, but I just kept saving page after page because it looked so cool. Once again, this manga is an adaptation of the first novel, meaning that we still haven't moved beyond the first half of the original manga. The setup is pretty much the same. Inugami is a transfer student in Aoshika's class. The class is mostly made up of delinquents that all want to fight Inugami. The manga hits all the important beats of the original story, and adds in a great deal of new stuff. In comparison to the original manga alone, everything is extremely exaggerated and incredibly stretched out. Scenes that might have been a page in the manga are now multi-part chapters, which can sometimes make Wolf Guy feel very bloated. And everything in general is way more graphic. Just as we saw with Crest of the Wolf, this story includes a lot more sex and violence. However, in this manga, everything is exaggerated to absurd levels of sleaze. It's constantly horny, and not in a good way. It's unavoidable at this point, so I think we should just talk about the manga's most infamous change. Aoshika's kidnapping has evolved from the original manga's simple damsel in distress storyline, to the film's inclusion of Hakuro's rape scene, to a full-blown gang rape scene. It's not just one scene, or one chapter. This entire ordeal begins at chapter 67, and lasts until chapter 82, at which point Aoshika is still kidnapped, drugged, and has had videos of her assault posted to the internet. This is in such bad taste that it's actually incredibly gratuitous. I have to stress this, because an entire volume of this manga is porn, and it earned Wolf Guy the unfortunate nickname in Western circles of Rape Namek. But even with the manga's most infamous scene, Wolf Guy had already earned its edgelord status with an entire arc about a school shooter out to kill Inugami. On their own, I'm not against any of these elements being included in a manga, but the key word here is taste. Everything in Wolf Guy feels tasteless, edgy for the sake of edge. If this were an edgy manga review, it would be getting a 5 out of 5. So with that being said, is there any merit to reading Wolf Guy? Well, yeah, kind of. When it comes to cool art and hyper-violent action, Wolf Guy excels. It excels so much that for all its faults, I somehow can't hate it. Their take on Haguro, the main villain of this manga, is downright iconic. He rises to such absurd levels of villainy that his one-sided obsession with Inugami actually becomes really engaging, and he develops more as a character than any other version of him ever has. Problem is, he develops into a much, much worse person. If you're on the fence about reading Wolf Guy, I can't give you a definitive yes or no about its quality. It has incredible high points and absolutely terrible lows, and somehow these points constantly intersect and overlap. I will say that if you're the type of person that seeks out edgy and violent manga to read, then you kind of owe it to yourself to read Wolf Guy. But if you're the type that's easily affected by graphic depictions of violence and rape, then there's nothing of value for you in Wolf Guy. I'm not even saying that as a condemnation. If somebody quit reading this manga, literally at any point in it, I would completely understand. The manga ends in a familiar place, similar to the Crest of the Wolf movie, except with Inugami presumed dead. Only one adaptation would manage to peek beyond this point in the manga, and it comes in a very unlikely form. So let's say you've watched Crest of the Wolf, you've read the 2007 manga, and you're dying to know what happens next. What could possibly be next? The OVA, of course. In 1992, Wolf Guy was adapted into a 6-episode OVA series, and instead of starting with Book 1, they chose to start directly with Book 2, which is extremely confusing. In fact, I started watching this early into my Wolf Guy deep dive before reading either of the manga, and I had to stop at the 10-minute mark when I realized I had no idea what was going on. So after flipping through the original manga and reading through the entirety of the 2007 manga, I returned to the anime and thought that it was mostly just boring. The first 2 episodes cover the end of the original manga, with the remainder about Inugami fighting different mercenary groups all after his blood. I didn't really touch on this, but ingesting a werewolf's blood in this universe gives you special powers and turns you into a monster. This is a recurring element in a lot of Wolf Guy media. The show's animation is never bad, but it's never amazing. And after the first 2 episodes, the plot begins to crawl at a snail's pace. It's the pinnacle of middle to low tier OVA, a mostly inoffensive entry in an incredibly offensive franchise. Oh, and in case you're wondering, Aoshika did in fact get pregnant from her rape. In fact, the anime wisely decides not to show anything explicit and has this information told to us through dialogue.
彼女妊娠しているのかもしれない。生理がないんじゃない？
一体誰の？
とにかく医者に見せた方がいいわね。もし妊娠だったとしたらどうする？青鹿に育児は無理よ。
わからん。犬神が何というか、それ以前にあいつに何と言って。
Despite giving us a continuation, it feels like it's spinning its wheels, giving us what seems like a side story instead of the next chapter. In fact, it doesn't really even give us a conclusive ending. It just kind of peters off in the very last episode. I don't really see a point in watching this. And even if you've absorbed every other English available Wolf Guy thing, there's not a whole lot here to talk about. Who would have figured that the least exploitive entry in the franchise would also be the least interesting? It does give me the impression that Wolf Guy peaked at the end of its first arc. There's nothing here on the level of Inugami and Haguro facing off, and that goes for any version of that story out there. So where does the Wolf Guy go from here? Well, he has a bit of growing up to do. Wolf Guy would prove to be so popular that it eventually received its own spin-off. Part sequel, part reboot, Adult Wolf Guy is still about Inugami Akira, except instead of being a werewolf middle schooler, he's now a werewolf investigative reporter. And to those of you who are wolf savvy, you might think, hey, wait a minute, wasn't there a werewolf reporter in Child Wolf Guy? That's right, this is the same basic premise as Jin Akira, a sleazy werewolf reporter with a heart of gold that helps Inugami out. So why isn't this about Jin? I legitimately do not know. While there are common themes, Adult Wolf Guy is completely unrelated to the original Wolf Guy outside of the name of the book and main character. It would be adapted into a 90s manga, just called Wolf Guy, and from what I've read, it's surprisingly good. It's drawn in a Gekiga style, reminiscent of Ryoichi Ikegami. This fits well with the gritty tone and detective style of Adult Wolf Guy. Inugami now has more personality than being just a misanthropic teen. Plus, he has an intersex partner that isn't played as a joke or something to be disgusted at. In fact, Adult Guy is actually surprisingly supportive and accepting of them. You know, for a series that delves into tasteless trash every single entry. That's not to say that this version of Wolf Guy is completely without sleaze. There's a naked woman practically every other page, don't worry. It's still there. Just that this might be the closest to a tasteful take on Wolf Guy. Not entirely in good taste, but it's almost there. If you like supernatural detectives, then this is a pretty neat manga to check out. But more importantly, Adult Wolf Guy was not just adapted into a manga, it was adapted into a film. A film that might be just one of the best worst movies to come out of Japan. Wolf Guy, Enraged Lycanthrope, is a trip. It is without a doubt one of the wackiest, most convoluted movies that I've ever seen. It stars film legend Sonny Chiba as our adult Inugami Akira. In this case, Inugami is investigating attacks perpetrated by an invisible psychic tiger, and things only get weirder from there. Now, it's important to talk about budget and lack thereof. While Crest of the Wolf was also low budget, it was a Toho movie, and that came with a certain level of production quality built into it. Enraged Lycanthrope does not. Corners are cut everywhere that they could possibly be cut. Our psychic tiger attacks are represented using the same stock footage of a tiger over and over again. But the most damning thing is Wolf Guy himself. At no point in this werewolf movie does Sonny Chiba ever transform into a half-wolf, half-man, or even a full wolf. As said before, in every iteration of Wolf Guy, the actual werewolf elements are downplayed to the point of being only tangentially related to the plot. It feels all too appropriate, then, that Chiba's Wolf Guy ends with a confrontation in broad daylight. And although he's somehow still being supercharged by the full moon, he never transforms at any point in the movie. If the film wasn't titled Wolf Guy, there's a chance that somebody could watch the whole thing and think that Inugami was just some sort of super strong moon mutant. But that's only the start of Wolf Guy's problems. This iteration is just as tasteless and just as exploitive as its predecessors, yet there's a big difference. All the characters are adults. There's no psychotic middle schoolers assaulting their homeroom teachers. Instead, Enraged Lycanthrope has the only instance where our main character engages in consensual sex with a woman. This is really breaking new ground for Wolf Guy. You gotta take victories where you can. The gritty crime elements of the story suddenly feel less out of place when the setting and characters are aged up into the adult world. But I feel like I have to say again, this isn't a good movie, just one that makes weird choices. Like putting this bizarre after-image effect on Wolf Guy while he's fighting a hitman powered up by a werewolf blood transfusion. Or what's even weirder is having this character unceremoniously die because the human and werewolf blood just didn't mix well together. The only part of this movie that is legitimately good is Sonny Chiba. Being a renowned martial artist, Chiba brings his best to each fight scene, which is unfortunately masked by sloppy editing, but there are a few moments where his skills truly shine. That is, when Wolf Guy isn't launching yen at his enemies. Of course, I have to mention the incredible soundtrack, possibly the funkiest soundtrack you'll ever find in a werewolf movie.
Mickey?
Enraged Lycanthrope is an experience, one that I've shared with multiple friends at this point, and even if they're confused and baffled by it, they always come out enthralled by the end. What is a Wolf Guy? After pouring through endless wolf tomes, I am at a bit of a loss. Sometimes it's a romance story, and other times it's a action thriller. Although it wears the trappings of a supernatural horror story, it doesn't actually veer into that genre too often. Is it a crime drama or a superhero story? Adult Wolf Guy certainly has shades of both, but it doesn't really fall neatly into either category. No, instead, what Wolf Guy is tasteless. Every incarnation, every iteration, has a moment or choice that seems so daring, yet is executed so poorly that it becomes tasteless. And maybe that's the reason why I am enamored with Wolf Guy. Not in spite of the series' faults, but because of them. Because of how underutilized the werewolf elements end up being. because of how tasteless and exploitive the darker themes are. And sometimes it's okay to enjoy something that's entirely in bad taste. Anyways, that's the video. I think I am the first person to do a wolf dive as deep as this one. I don't know if I'm entirely happy with my journey, but I did it. If you want a place to start with Wolf Guy, honestly, the two easiest ones, for all their faults, are the 2007 manga and the Enraged Lycanthrope movie. By now, you should know everything about their faults, so, you know, good luck if you decide to watch or read them. Not sure when this video is coming out, so I don't know what I should be teasing next, but yeah, we got some more stuff coming. Stick around, I guess.